Welcome, everyone, to Vancouver Rape Relief's 2020 Montreal Massacre Memorial. This year, we are hosting a series of 12 online events. You can find the full program on our website at rapereliefshelter.bc.ca. We are live on Facebook and on Zoom for today's event titled Abolition of Prostitution, International Feminist Overview, and this is the first part. My name is Sophia, and I'm a frontline worker and collective member of Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter, and I'll be hosting today's panel. So as feminists, we believe in a world free from prostitution and all forms of sexual exploitation. We understand the root cause of prostitution as men's entitlement to paid access to women's bodies and their belief in the right to purchase women and girls. Women's entry into prostitution is most often the result of economic desperation and prior experiences of violence. Women often cannot escape prostitution because of the violence committed against them by pimps and johns, poverty, addiction, or precarious immigration status. Prostitution has always been and remains a sexist and racist institution that is based on the existing inequalities between men and women, adults and children, rich and poor, as well as race inequalities. It is the commodification and objectification of women's bodies for men's use, as well as violence against women. Because we believe that governments have a role to play in our security and in sharing our basic provisions, feminists have been campaigning for the Nordic model. As most of you in the audience know, the Nordic model, also known as the equality model, criminalizes the purchasing of women for sex by finding sex buyers and provides for services for women to be able to exit prostitution. We believe that this model will get us closer to ending the prostitution of women and thus establishing women's full rights. However, very few countries globally have something close to the Nordic model in law or in practice today. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from our panelists about the prostitution laws and legal frameworks in their respective countries, application of these laws, the situation of women in prostitution, and the work they are doing towards the abolition of prostitution. I am joined by Jean Enriquez of the Coalition Against Trafficking of Women in the Philippines, Tegan Laren of the Coalition Against Trafficking of Women in Australia, Ali Marie Diamond of Wahina Toa Rising in New Zealand, and my fellow collective member, Hilla Kerner. We will be taking questions from the audience through Zoom and Facebook Live after the panel. So what we will do first is start with a 10 to 15 minute presentation from each of our panelists. As a reminder, please introduce yourself and your organization, give us an overview of the current prostitution laws in your country and how they are applied, as well as what kinds of social programs or economic support and exiting services might be available to women. Jean, we can start with you if you're ready.
Thank you so much, Sophia and Hila. And I would like to thank Vancouver Rape Relief Center for this invitation. I'm also happy to be with my sisters from the Pacific, Tegan, Ali Marie, and of course Hila, who will also be sharing with us. So I follow the outline that was provided to us. I'm going to start by introducing what we do in the organization. At least in the Philippines, because we try to pilot our programs in the Philippines and then replicate them in other parts of Asia. At least in Asia, not yet in the rest of the Pacific, but we have gone as well to Papua New Guinea. If you would allow me, I would like to show some photos of what we do. I wonder if it's showing right now. So we strengthen our network in Asia Pacific. And through our conferences, our regular regional meetings, we are able to strategize on what to do in terms of harmonizing the prostitution laws in relation to the United Nations Protocol on Trafficking, which squarely addresses the demand side of prostitution, as well as ensures that all victims of trafficking, including those in prostitution, with or without consent, are protected. So in our conferences, we also talk about the replication, as I've mentioned, of model projects, especially those that are addressing the demand side. And also we continue to project the voices of prostitution survivors themselves. So in these photos, you will see survivor leaders from India as well as in two parts of the Philippines, especially in the place where the American military bases were installed, which created a huge demand for prostituted women. We also recently met, you can see Tigan at the back, in Bangkok, and we continue to consolidate our common strategies on fighting the sex industry, including the pornography industry in Japan and elsewhere. And at the local level, one of those that we model are educating local governments, even in the Muslim areas, which are considered to be areas of conflict where women are most vulnerable to prostitution. So for the rest of Asia, that would also be places where the Rohingyas are, and we know that there's a very high rate of prostitution in Bangladesh, as well as in other countries where the Rohingyas are considered as refugees. And we also have these community-based pimp watch programs, wherein we empower through education the displaced women, those displaced by climate crisis. You know that the Asia Pacific is like the yellow canary in the mine, and we are always devastated by strong typhoons, etc. And we conduct comprehensive women's rights education and preventive trainings of preventive of trafficking and prostitution. So these are women, displaced women, who are monitoring the evacuation camps, and because of this program, there's reduced numbers in terms of all forms of violence against women, not only prostitution and trafficking, but also domestic violence and rape. So these are very brave women who have put to jail male perpetrators of violence against women. And we educate also local governments. There's more hope in local governments than national government, at least in the Philippines, in preventing sex tourism. And incidentally, we did this with Canada Fund for Local Initiatives. And the Philippine ambassador joined us in going around with us and conducting this program against sex tourism, such that we were able to convince the local government to issue seals of trafficking-free tourism to hotel establishments that are against trafficking and prostitution, and are training their personnel to prevent trafficking and prostitution. And you know, I have already spoken before about our young men's camps on gender issues, sexuality, and prostitution, and this has been replicated in Thailand, India, and Indonesia, which educates men on the myths of prostitution and allows them the venue to revisit their socialization and therefore to redefine their own sexuality, so that all graduates of the camps do not use women in prostitution. And of course, we have our own advocacy with young women to prevent also their victimization in prostitution. And we have researchers, especially in indigenous communities in mining areas, that also become magnets, providing demand for prostitution. And we have direct documentation of cases. So we have skills trainings on that. We rescue from trafficking situations, especially cyber prostitution, and we also have empowerment of survivors programs. These are survivors leaders in the military bases areas in the Philippines. And we also pilot cooperative type livelihood programs which provide exit for survivors. These are all survivors of prostitution who have initiated their livelihood. And we conduct psychological first aid with orphans of the killings related to the war on drugs that's currently being implemented by the very oppressive, repressive Duterte government that we have in the Philippines right now. So our work has been tripled since the authoritarian government took over. So in the Philippine law, we follow the, please give me the time, anytime, just in case I'm I'm going spilling over. So we follow the definition of trafficking according to the UN protocol. So these are the acts of trafficking and therefore acts of prostitution by buyers and also by the businesses would fall under this. So buyers would fall under the receipt of persons, especially women and children, taking advantage of the vulnerability of the person for the purpose of prostitution or other forms of sexual exploitation, and that can include pornography and others. So in Section 4 of our law, it is unlawful, very clear that it is unlawful to recruit, obtain, hire, provide, etc., a person by any means for the purpose of prostitution, pornography, or other forms of sexual exploitation. Even marrying of a woman or any person for that matter to a foreign national, again, for the purpose of sexual exploitation is being penalized under our law. What's also very explicitly referring to prostitution under the Philippine law is organizing sex tours. And also the acts of buyer to maintain or hire a person to engage in prostitution or pornography. So this is a very positive sections of our law, and there's very clear legal protection of all, and prostituted persons can fall under this. And if you would note, regardless of consent, so they should not be criminalized. So penalties for both businesses and buyers of prostitution could be 20 years for the main acts of trafficking and the fine of 1 million to 2 million pesos. Even attempts to hire a person for prostitution can fall again under attempted trafficking in persons that could be punished for 15 years. And then qualified acts of trafficking would be those involving children, and if the women suffered from HIV, mutilation, and if they are syndicated or are happening in large scale. So there's a very explicit section on penalizing buying of persons trafficked to prostitution. So we are educating local governments about the use of this, but here is the problem. Coming from our colonizer Spain, we inherited a law that still penalizes quote-unquote prostitutes, and therefore this is contradictory to the anti-trafficking law. So what we do is we educate police and prosecutors not to use this archaic law. So in the amendment that we filed just 2 days ago in the Senate, this is going to be removed. So this is just a very quick overview of how prostitution evolved in the Philippines. So as you can see, during the pre-colonial period, there's no documentation of prostitution, but it was brought by Spanish, American, and Japanese colonizers. So in terms of the question of how is the law being implemented, I have just, I think, 3 remaining slides. The government in 2019 initiated prosecution of 266 alleged traffickers as compared to 227 in 2018. So there's an increase. And you can see from the pattern that there's still more forms of sex trafficking than labor trafficking, even as funders would insist on the government to focus on labor trafficking, which is the trend everywhere else in the world. So this is coming from the US Trafficking in Persons report. But a lot, again, of those who are punished for sex trafficking are often victimizing minors, but not the adult women. This is also a problem in terms of implementation. Okay. In terms of protection of victims or services for exit, it is severely lacking. So what the Department of Social Welfare and Development is providing are the following: the temporary shelter, livelihood assistance is very measly. They will be providing 10,000 pesos for the victims of trafficking, and it's not going far in their lives. No? It can just be used to pay off their debts. So these are the services that are provided by the government. In terms of, I think I'll just address emerging issues if there are questions from our audience. Thank you very much, and I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Jean. I'll have Tegan introduce herself next.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for having me. It's really an honour to be here with you all to talk about this important issue. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land I'm speaking from today, land that was never ceded. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I'd like to recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are leaders in working to address the disproportionate levels of violence enacted against them, their children and their families. So my name is Tegan Lauren. I'm a member of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Australia, CATWA, which is the Australian branch of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women International. So we're a feminist organisation and we work locally and internationally to end all forms of sexual exploitation of women, especially prostitution, trafficking and pornography. So our work is primarily in advocacy, writing submissions and being involved with government inquiries. I've been at CATWA for a few years, but prior to my involvement with CATWA, I volunteered with two frontline organisations in Melbourne, one that works with women primarily in street-based prostitution, and another feminist organisation that is a support and referral service for women in the sex industry, including women who've been trafficked. I'm currently undertaking a PhD, which focuses on the unregulated sex industry in Melbourne, which is the capital city of Victoria, Australia, and specifically my research focuses on brothels that operate under the guise of massage businesses and the policy and legislative frameworks surrounding them. So I'll give some background about prostitution laws in Australia. Australia has a sort of patchwork of differing legislative approaches to prostitution across its 6 states and 2 territories. So while prostitution in and of itself is not criminalised anywhere in Australia, some prostitution related activities such as brothel keeping or street solicitation are prohibited in some states and territories, although these are often tolerated informally. So each of the 8 jurisdictions approach prostitution from slightly different legislative models. However, the majority have either legalised or fully decriminalised prostitution as work. So 3 have legalised and 2 have full decriminalisation. The pro-prostitution lobby continues to push for full decriminalisation in the remaining states and territories. So, for example, in my home state of Victoria, which already has one of the oldest systems of legalisation in the world, where brothel prostitution was legalised in 1984, a parliamentary review into implementing decriminalisation was undertaken this year. The review concluded recently and we're awaiting sort of the outcome, but it's likely that full decriminalisation will come into effect in Victoria next year. So I'll just talk about this review because I think it's indicative of the sort of climate of decrim being introduced in Australia. So I use the term review quite loosely because it wasn't actually a review in the sense of a review into prostitution legislative models, but rather a review into how to implement full decriminalisation. The review was led by a member of parliament who has links to sex industry organisations and political lobby groups that have been advocating for decriminalisation quite literally for decades. So CATWA saw this as a clear conflict of interest, and we felt that the outcome of the review was already decided before it started. So we're concerned because there's very little evidence to suggest decriminalisation is an effective model or successful in reducing harm to women in prostitution. There was no transparency of the decision-making process behind why the government chose decriminalisation as a model to be implemented. And despite the review sort of stating that it would consult with relevant and diverse stakeholders, at least 4 survivor-led organisations that I'm aware of asked to be involved in the consultation sessions but were rejected by the review team. And this included women with experience in the sex industry under both legalised and decriminalised models in Australia and New Zealand. So I guess unsurprisingly, considering the sort of circumstances of the review, it seems they didn't want to hear any criticism of decriminalisation. So I think this just sort of shows how it's a kind of top-down approach. There's no proper consultation, no proper process in bringing in decriminalisation. So Australia largely treats prostitution as work through legalisation and decriminalisation, but in practice, prostitution is sort of put in a too hard basket where in effect it's not regulated, and there are very little worker protections and entitlements and no effective protection against male violence against women. So for example, women are still murdered in the sex industry, even if it's fully decriminalised or legalised, and violence and murder are very much just considered to be part of the job. So aside from some of the worst harms, even from a sort of workplace rights perspective, legalisation and decriminalisation have not led to better working conditions. In fact, some survivors of prostitution have said that legalisation and decriminalisation make things worse because it gives the sex buyer consumer power. So a good example of this is in the Northern Territory of Australia, which passed decriminalisation last year, and now allows sex buyers to sue for breach of contract if a woman retracts consent for a sex act. In addition to this, basic workplace entitlements and protections are not afforded women in the sex industry. So, for example, it's usual for brothels to take 50 to 60% of a woman's earnings. Women are employed on what are known as sham contracts. So they're employed technically as an independent contractor, but then they're sort of treated as an employee. So they're told when they have to work, what they have to wear, and so on. But then they don't get any of the benefits of being an employee, like protections or a minimum hourly rate. So they're paid by the booking, which means potentially they could wait in a brothel all day and not earn any money. And according to Australia's peak sex worker body, Scarlet Alliance, sex workers don't get sick pay and holiday pay, and many have no superannuation or savings, which I think really shows the massive failures of the system of legalisation and decriminalisation. In terms of occupational health and safety, women are expected to conduct medical checks on sex buyers' genitals to check for signs of sexually transmitted infections. We know that many STIs don't show visible signs, and part of the job is to handle biohazardous bodily materials, including having them inserted into their bodies, and there's very little personal protective equipment for this. And we also know that sex buyers constantly try to remove condoms during a booking, even though technically removing a condom is against the law. So overall, I think despite the fact that legally or technically the sex industry is treated as work, in practice there's very little oversight. It's kind of ridiculous to try to apply the kinds of occupational health and safety standards to this industry, and things like sexual harassment and discrimination. Also, like, how do we imply that? Women are literally chosen for their physical appearance, age, race, and perceived racial attributes. And women are often advertised by these. So clearly decriminalisation does not work in favour of so-called workers, but rather that of sex buyers, pimps, and brothel owners. Yet decriminalisation is being increasingly promoted and adopted in Australia. And decriminalisation is argued for with the opinion that it will reduce harm, reduce stigma, and therefore protect women. There's a lack of evidence to support this. And, we've had legalisation for over 35 years in Victoria and decriminalisation in New South Wales since 1995. Stigma has not reduced for women. It has made sex buying and brothel owning more acceptable and normalised, but women are still stigmatised. So the argument that these models will reduce stigma is clearly false. Decriminalisation and legalisation does lead to the normalisation and expansion of the sex industry. And we know that Australia's sex industry already relies on women trafficked from Asian and Southeast Asian countries to fill the demand by working in the brothels. So the idea that prostitution is an empowering choice for women's work has become so normalised that it's being promoted by mainstream feminism in Australia. And I think it's a real sign of how entrenched the sex work ideology has become when pimps, sex buyers and feminists are all advocating for the same thing, full decriminalisation. And I guess what I find extremely frustrating is that many of these feminists who promote prostitution as sex work, often forcefully and usually with a sort of air of superiority, have never even set foot inside a brothel, let alone done any form of prostitution themselves. And more often than not, promoters of prostitution that call themselves sex workers or sex work activists don't even do prostitution. So there are plenty of cases in Australia where so-called sex work activists actually produce porn, so benefit off the backs of other women in prostitution, or they do some kind of other activity that falls under the sort of catch-all term of sex work, like non-penetrative BDSM or something like that. But mainstream feminists have sort of swallowed this empowerment narrative whole to the point where they ignore any criticism of prostitution and even actively silence survivors of prostitution. So promotion of this idealized version of prostitution that is not really based in reality is dangerous because it sells an idea to women that more often than not is not actually what happens. And we know that in reality, most women in prostitution are controlled by a pimp, most of their earnings go to someone else, they face extreme violence and so on. But also the other side of this sort of promoting this idea is that it completely hides the role of men. The fact that prostitution exists because men demand sexual access to women's bodies, that men are the ones committing violence against women in the sex trade. And this is all hidden by focusing on this idea of a sex worker. This kind of sex worker rhetoric focuses on individual women in prostitution, but it's not really, the question should be about men and their behaviour. Why do we provide a class of women, inevitably the most marginalised, for men so that they can pay to access them sexually? So I'll just briefly talk about exit services. There are very few organisations in Australia that support women to exit or transition out of the sex industry, and the ones that do exist are underfunded. Exit services threaten the idea that prostitution is a job like any other. So where prostitution is treated as work, like in most of Australia, exit services are seen as unnecessary or even offensive because it would suggest prostitution is different from other types of work, which it clearly is. Part of what COVID has highlighted is the need for government initiatives to support women to exit prostitution and to assist them into other kinds of work. Because of the horrendous workplace conditions, including for those working under decriminalised and legalised systems, which I've already spoken about, and according to the Scott Alliance, COVID lockdown restrictions have directly impacted the ability of those in the industry to even maintain housing, buy food and basic items, support their dependents and access healthcare and prescriptions. So I think that this reality really contradicts this idea that prostitution is a high paid job. And the Australian government made support available to those who lost their jobs during COVID. So theoretically, women in legalised and decriminalised prostitution should have been eligible for financial support from the government, as other workers were. However, many women in Australia's sex industry are ineligible for a variety of reasons. For example, many are on temporary visas, do not have a fixed address, and many don't want to disclose their source of income in order to make a claim. So again, examples of how even though prostitution is treated as work, it clearly isn't like other jobs. We know that the primary reason women enter the sex industry is out of extreme financial need. So it was not surprising that when provided other means of financial support by the government, women chose to exit prostitution. One Melbourne-based organisation that supports women, including to exit the industry, reported a 150% increase in women seeking their services due to COVID. So funding for services is something that CATWA advocates for, because prostitution is not the same as other jobs. There are many barriers to exiting the industry, such as homelessness, drug and alcohol addiction, and violence and discrimination. And we believe that funding should be made available for exit programs and other forms of comprehensive and appropriate social and economic support for all trafficked women, and as well as any women who wish to leave the sex industry. Exit services should be included as an essential part of any model of prostitution legislation or regulation, and are a key pillar of the Nordic or equality model, which is the model of prostitution legislation we advocate for. Thanks.
Tegan, it's very instructive to hear you reiterate what we know about decriminalization and legalization, that it doesn't reduce stigma, that it doesn't reduce violence against women, and that it normalizes and expands the sex industry, but also heartening to hear that more women have access to exiting services during the pandemic. And we'll have Ali speak next to the situation in New Zealand.
Hi everyone, I'd just like to say thank you on behalf of Wahine Toa Rising for having us here today. We're really honoured to be a part of this panel with you all. So my name is Ali Marie Diamond, and I'm the spokesperson for Wahine Toa Rising in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We are survivor-led, and so I am reading on things because I haven't really prepared anything, but we are survivor-led, and we support Wahine Toa, which is warrior women, and Tamariki, our children, who have and are being exploited in the sex trade in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The current laws regarding prostitution in New Zealand are, we are under full decriminalisation, which is under the Prostitution Reform Act. Look, I guess I'm coming to you as a survivor, and I'm not incredibly educated in laws. As a survivor, I can just see that full decriminalisation isn't working in New Zealand. We still have children as young as 9 who are being pimped on the streets in some of our major cities in New Zealand. These children are of, many of them are Māori or Pacific Islander cultures. And this is caused, from poverty, circumstances, which is leading to families who are feeling the need that this is the only way that they can, I guess, get an income into the home or look after their families, which is really disheartening. We've heard of 12-year-old girls who have been working in licensed, registered brothels in some of the main cities in New Zealand, which is also shows that full decriminalisation isn't working. I often say I don't think I need to be down on all the laws to know that, that it's not working and something needs to be done. Full decriminalisation has really normalised the buying and selling of sex, I feel, there. It hasn't gotten better, it's gotten worse. I was on the streets in New Zealand before 2003. It was pretty horrific then. My sister was on the streets after 2003, and it wasn't any better, it was probably worse. I know you probably have a lot of questions because I'm probably not going to cover everything that you probably need to know. The reality is it's completely normal. During COVID, I was asked to do a bit of research on some of the forums where men were going to buy women or to still buy sex during COVID. It was horrific. That's all I can say, absolutely horrific. Men, still asking women to put themselves on the line and put their lives at risk for them to still have, sexual gratification during this time. Men saying that, come on, we need this, it's going to decrease our depression, you need to sell sex to us because then we'll have less suicides. Yeah, it was crazy. I just, it was quite an experience going through those forums as a survivor, and quite traumatic. We do know of someone who was working and was raped when she refused sex without a condom. The police wouldn't charge him with rape. Instead, he was charged for not wearing the condom and fined, as it's the responsibility of the Ministry of Health to make sure the laws are enforced under the Reform Act. Most women working in the brothels in New Zealand are treated as independent contractors, so few employment laws apply to them. New Zealand has a system of welfare benefits that any eligible person can apply for. It isn't generally available though to anyone on a temporary visa. So any women coming in from overseas who are on a travel visa, a visiting visa, who are not permanent residents or citizens of New Zealand are not actually under the Prostitution Reform Act. Which there's a lot of women in New Zealand who are from other countries such as Asian countries, Philippines, Thailand, who are coming in and being coerced into sex trade or trafficked into the sex trade, and they're not actually under any, they're not actually legal to work. Sorry, I'm just reading because I've got a great team of people behind me and they've put together some stuff, you know, law-wise and logical-wise, because I'm not extremely logical or analytical. I'm more heart-led. So excuse me while I'm reading, because I'm just reading some of the things I've written for me. Thank you, Jenny. The New Zealand Prostitution Collective receives around 1 million in funds annually from the Ministry of Health to carry out its operations. Exit services, however, are only mentioned on their website in relation to people under 18 in the sex trade. Depending on the location, there may be NZPC outreach workers who do give basic support to exiting women on a casual basis. However, Wahine Toa Rising appears to be the only group making comprehensive wraparound exit services for women and young people and children a policy priority in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I guess that's one thing that we're really passionate about at Wahine Toa Rising, is making sure that exit services are a priority. That regardless of law, exit services must be funded and they must be a priority, because for every woman who chooses to be in the sex trade, there are hundreds of women and young people who are there by circumstance and not by choice. So it's really important that we also look after them and that we also hear them and that they are given that choice to exit. So that's something, you know, as a sex trade survivor that I'm extremely, extremely passionate about, is making sure that exit services are a priority everywhere, that we are fighting more for exit services, because there's just, there's too many women, too many children who are getting into prostitution and into the sex trade because they feel that this is the only way, they can provide for their families. They feel this is the only way they can keep a roof over their head, food on the table, their children in school, and we really have to do better. So yeah, that's, I guess, where I'm at. And I've probably rambled a bit, so I'm sorry, but if you've got any questions, it's probably easier for me.
Well, we appreciate all the work you're doing to provide exiting services for women. I can imagine the political pressure on you is immense. And as Tegan said, it's incredibly hard to actually even argue that anyone needs to exit under a fully decriminalized regime. So we really, really appreciate that and all of your thoughts so far. And we'll open it up for questions later, but we can have Hilla give us the situation in Canada here.
Yes, it is such a privilege to hear you, Ali. We have many years relationship with KW in the Philippines and in Australia. And what's New Zealand has been hailed as the model to strive to from the pro-sex work in Canada. So having someone from with personal experience, but also from grassroots organizing, telling the truth is very, very powerful to our Canadian audience and in general. So the situation in Canada. Sorry, Hila, Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter. I'm sure you all know about our work, and I'm sure you already did, and if not, you will today. After this, go to our website, and on the homepage, you will see our recent report detailing what 100 women who we worked with in the last year told us about their experience in prostitution. The high rate of women needing to depend on drug or alcohol to survive in prostitution, the level of poverty, homelessness, and the devastating early age of entry. So the situation in Canada. In 2013, the Supreme Court of Canada struck down the old prostitution laws that were very similar to what Jean described as the current old laws in the Philippines. The old laws were bad. They treated prostitution as a moral issue and as a public nuisance. And all the parties considered to be committing offense. The brothel owners, the men who buy sex, the pimps, and the women and transgender people or vulnerable men who have been prostituting. The reality was even worse because men were not arrested, not the men who profit from women in prostitution, not the men who owning brothel houses, not the men who buying women in prostitution. Historically, the only group who were treated as criminals were the women in prostitution. And there are terrible testimonies about police harassing, criminalizing, humiliating women in prostitution. There are local evidence from Vancouver about police picking up a prostituted woman and dropping her at the edge of the city and she needs to walk home, or women in prostitution coerced to give blowjobs to police officers so they will not be arrested. And Vancouver in particular has a shameful history with the police disregarding the life of women in prostitution. There were a very famous case of a mass murderer, and there was an inquiry here that in 2010 and 11, the Opal inquiry that really exposed how the police disregarded the life of women in prostitution, overly indigenous women from the downtown east side, completely disregard report on their disappearance and their murder. And all that in mind, there was a Supreme Court case that ended up with striking down the laws, and the Supreme Court gave Canada a year to come up with an alternative legal scheme. And this is when the government at the time introduced Bill C-36, also known as the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. And that law make the distinguishing, the separation that feminists called for. We understand prostitution as mostly harmful practice that most women do not choose it, and that the men who buy women in prostitution and profit from women in prostitution are profiting from women's vulnerability. And the law, especially the preamble of the law, really captured it well. The law was also had the presumption to support organizations who are providing exiting services, but that has been very, very weak across the country. And we just did the law also has a clause about a review, 5 years review. And I think there will later on be a question about media and politicians, so I will not speak to that. But so far the review has not happened. But we and other feminists that we are in alliances with, looked at what's going on in the ground. So the law in Canada is federal, but the application of the law is based on the different provinces, different police forces, and different prosecutors that here are called Crown. So the three prairies provinces, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta, actually have been pretty proactive and have been arresting men who buy women in prostitution. And it's important to note that when we call to criminalization of men, we are not calling for imprisonment. In general, we know from our work and other organization work and the Black Lives Matter movement and the Indigenous resistance, prisons are full with people racialized people who come from poverty that are mainly criminalized for property crimes. It's very, very rare that men will be in prison for male violence against women. And what we want is for men to be held accountable, for men to be facing a judge, and the judge will tell him what you did is wrong, what you did is unacceptable. So only street provinces really took it on. The most common punishment, the only punishment if there is a conviction is a fine. The law has some room for more than that, but we have no issue with that. We have an issue with all the provinces who decided that even though there is a law, there is no need to arrest men who buy women in prostitution. In particular, in British Columbia, the data is striking, which is our province. Very, very few arrests, usually of men who were procuring underage girls, which is actually part of the old law. So it has nothing to do with application of the new law. And our own city, Vancouver, has been, since the exposure of how much they basically colluded with violent men by not responding to the report of missing and murdered women, and the exposure of how they themselves harmed women in prostitution, their behavior change was hands-off completely. So they came, before the new law passed, they came with sex work guidelines that stating that sex is work, and that they do not see any need to intervene between a transaction or an act that is happening between two consenting adults. So that's their formal policy. When on the data that they issue every year, the Vancouver Police Department about reports to police on different crimes. The one about sexual assault is a different panel, but they're very, very proud to say zero. Zero reports, which means zero cases on prostitution in Vancouver. The city of Vancouver, which is responsible for the Vancouver Police Department, argued against Bill C-36, against the criminalization of men, and they have a very comprehensive position about health and safety for sex workers and community impacted by sex work, and the prevention of sexual exploitation. So what we're dealing with in Canada, that there is a huge promotion, like the rest of you described, about prostitution as an empowerment, as liberation, as choice, prostitution and pornography. And I will say in bracket, pornography is a documentation of prostitution. Women's bodies are bought and sold. The only difference is it's also recorded and the images are being produced and profited from. So there is a huge neoliberal promotion of prostitution as empowerment, but the overwhelming evidence, death, violence against women in prostitution, the overrepresentation of Indigenous women and Black women in street prostitution, the massage parlor who are full with Asian women who do not speak the language. So there is kind of a huge contradiction between choice, empowerment, liberation, freedom, and the reality that it's just impossible to avoid. So Canada and the different provinces and municipalities are kind of dancing two dances. And there is no way, doesn't matter what side you are, not to have empathy to all those women who suffer genuine harm. The difference is the analysis of the harm and the response to the harm. But so in that context, the Vancouver City issued a position paper naming some priorities issues, pretty good. One is enhanced prevention and awareness of sexual exploitation. That's number one. They have done nothing on it as far as we can tell. And we are monitor media and we're living here and our communities here. The second one is address the gap in services and support for sex workers, including opportunity to transition from sex work. Again, very, very few exiting services, the same as what other women described, because exiting means that sex work is not work, that it's not a choice, it's not empowerment, and it will force the province and the city to take really, really active steps. So the positions that Vancouver took, and it's taken from another regime, from the drug use is the harm reduction. And Vancouver has been most proactive on providing women not with housing, not with money, not with detox and recovery, not with childcare, not with education, not with alternative employment. Vancouver has been a leader on providing women clean needles and condoms. So yeah, and we're talking about one of the richest cities in the world, one of the richest countries in the world, and that's what they have to offer to women in prostitution. I have other data. I don't know where I am in terms of time, so I'm going to tell you a few more things because we're talking about the epidemic and COVID and prostitution. So two terrible companionship for women in prostitution is one is drug use. And we just know all too well how women either first enter to prostitution and then become addicted to drugs, or experience male violence as children or young women addicted to drug and then enter to prostitution to try to fund this. 274 women died because of overdose in British Columbia in 2020, mainly from fentanyl. So that's one terrible reality of women in prostitution. The other terrible reality is poverty. Canada is a liberal welfare state, which the premise is you give only to the most destitute people as little as possible. So the welfare rates are in this across the country, and in British Columbia are just unbelievable. I also printed that data to tell you, although I know it by heart, a single woman will get $375 for rent. And I just looked at Craigslist today, price of market housing. I couldn't find anything less than $950. So the economic support that women getting from this province is just keeping them impoverished, keeping them addicted. And in that context, the cities that we live in, the province that we live in, the countries that we live in are completely colluding with the profiteer, with the men who buy women in prostitution, because they entrench the inequality and offer nothing for women as an alternative.
Thank you, Hilla. I think you illustrated very well how prostitution is a product of women's inequality and further reinforces women inequalities, which is why we are all working towards the abolition of prostitution. So what I'm going to move towards next is some questions from our audience. I'll have Tegan, if you're able to elaborate, to give some examples on how you substantiate the argument that stigmatization has not decreased during 30+ years of legalization and decriminalization. What are you quoting or referencing when you were mentioning that in your panel speak earlier?
I would say that the levels of violence there and the general treatment, I guess, and discrimination that women still face. So there are lots of reports in the media fairly consistently of women in prostitution in New South Wales, which has decriminalisation, and in Victoria, of women being murdered at work or facing these kinds of extreme levels of violence. So last year, there was a woman tragically murdered in Sydney, and she was a sex worker. And shortly after her murder, other women in the sex industry commented that murder and rape is part of the job. I think it's not a controversial claim. I think it's well understood that women face, these levels. And I guess that the argument that the stigma is the biggest sort of problem that we need to combat. And if we could just reduce stigma, then we would see a reduction against violence against women. It's just, we just haven't seen a reduction to be able to make that claim.
I think stigma is always a tricky one, because how do you measure that? And I think violence against women is the stigma. Ali Marie, in your speak, you mentioned $1 million from the Ministry of Health, and one of our audience member would like to know more about that, if you can elaborate on that money and what that money actually goes to.
Well, I probably can't. That money goes to the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, or NZPC, in New Zealand, who I'm trying to politely describe them. A lot of people call them some not very nice names, but they're basically an organisation where women and young people go to if they are in need of assistance. So I guess condoms, information. New Zealand Prostitutes Collective have a booklet that's called Stepping Forward. It's basically a booklet that I guess this is an instruction manual on what to do in the sex trade. So best way to give blowjobs, how to take anal safely, how to get yourself out of trouble. Their advice is to cry fire if you're in trouble, because people are more likely to come and help you if you call fire. Wear a whistle around your neck. Not very good advice, but it'd probably get used in some sort of sex game or something. But I guess this is where the $1 million funding goes, is to staffing this organisation to do whatever they do. I cannot comment exactly how they spend that money, because I'm not NZPC, but it's a lot of funding, and that's not the only funding they get. They get other funding from local councils to have, you know, women out and about helping the street workers, which is great, but the funding is quite large. So I guess I could talk about it for hours. My thing is, Jesus, what I could do with $1 million for exit services and supporting women the way they actually need to be supported, rather than supporting them to stay in the sex trade, which is basically what NZPC gets, I guess, is for women to stay there.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like the money is going to fund a pro-prostitution lobbying group mainly. Okay, so there's a few more questions that are directly to some of the panelists, but maybe I think we can ask a more general question that we got from Jean, which I think is really important to address, asking if we're not jailing Johns, how do we actually imagine holding them to account, or what does that actually look like, which I think is something important to address when we're, like Hilla said, contending with the realities of what jails does to men and how it actually doesn't reduce violence against women. So if anyone would like to elaborate on that, with how they've imagined it working, if the Nordic model was actually applied in their countries, or you had the Nordic model.
I'll take up the challenge. I know, by the way, I talked to Gunilla, and I think in Sweden, which is kind of our model, even though I know that the exiting services is not consistent across the country, they have not been jailing men, they have been fining men. So we as an anti-violence organization have been struggling with the questions, how to hold men accountable. We believe men can change, but unfortunately, all the evidence are that they're not gonna, not willingly, freely in their lifetime. So accountability is a serious issue. And we know not only how the criminal justice system putting a lot of focus on criminalizing people because of their poverty, including in relation to prostitution. Women are not criminalized for being prostitution, but they will be criminalized on other things. There is one crime that is like impediment of traffic. So people who are poor, people who are racialized, the criminal justice system, at least in Canada and I think in more places, established from the intention of the state to protect the property of the wealthy class. And it still very much shape how the criminal justice work. And we know from the data about rape that only 20% of sexual assault cases, and sexual assault and rape is something that we have at least formal social consensus that is not acceptable phenomena, unlike prostitution. Only 20% will actually go to court, and only half of them will actually end up with conviction. So we see very, very poor response in relation to sexual assault, similar to wife bettering. And as I said, in prostitution, we see even less than that. So where we are in terms of our work as a collective, we do want men to be criminalized. We believe there is value to an agent of the state telling a woman, you are convicted for committing a crime against women. And we want the name of the man who committed a crime to be public, because we think that naming and shaming men has a huge, important value. We are striving to a society that we do not need to do that we will live in a community that other men will take it on, that it will be known that it's an unacceptable way to treat women, children, and vulnerable transgender people, but we're not there yet. So at the moment we do have to rely on the state, and we do put a lot of effort, even though the system is so crooked to begin with. And we know that when a lot of time when we try to do reform, you pull out one brick of the wall, and they're finding a way to not to make it as significantly meaningful. We are going to continue to press for the criminal justice system, for the police to thoroughly investigate reports on prostitution, sexual assault, and wife bettering, for the Crown to proceed with charges, and for judges who are fairly ignorant on all forms of violence against women. So we're calling on transparency of judgment. At the moment, most crimes against women are in provincial courts, so the verdicts are being done verbally and not transcribed, so nobody can see what actually the judge decided and why. So we're calling on accountability and transparency of the criminal justice system, but we will be satisfied if men will be publicly known to be convicted of a crime against women. We believe that will have an impact. And there is a difference between how different sectors are treating prostitution. There are the politicians, there are the liberals, there is a mainstream media who is terrible, but there is a grassroots understanding of women and men of conscience that prostitution is bad. So we believe that if there is a public naming and a public shaming reinforced by a conviction, it will have a serious deterring impact.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's always important to mention too that all of this always has to go hand in hand with women to be actually able to survive economically outside of prostitution as well, so that they're not left without a way to survive.
Although we're not fooling ourselves, it's not that any woman that we work with actually makes money out of prostitution.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to add to that question or respond from the panelists?
Or disagree, Jean?
Is that all right?
Yes, yeah.
And I can probably segue to answers to questions here in the Zoom room. I think, as I was telling Tegan, I think it's a discussion that we have to have, because we, of course, look at prostitution in the continuum of rape and other forms of violence against women. And in the case of prostitution, to the survivors that we organize, it is repeated rape that and therefore there are many forms of torture that we are not punishing if there is no corresponding penalties for customers as such. I was just very surprised, and I'm concerned that this is the same argument that many who are for decriminalization are saying. I'm really sorry to say that. So I think it's a debate that we need to have, a healthy debate. And
I agree, because we have a shared goal, women's liberation.
Yes, and therefore, to segue to answers to questions in terms of prostitution-free hotels, we are working with 3 sectors. I mentioned about local governments issuing executive orders that only hotels that have undergone anti-trafficking, anti-prostitution trainings, and have instituted guidelines to ensure that they are trafficking or prostitution free will receive trafficking free seal, and therefore will be promoted to tourists who are looking for not only eco-friendly establishments, but also trafficking-free establishments. But we also work with unions. We have very strong work with the labor movement, not only in the Philippines, but also at the regional level. And we're working with tourist hotel or establishment workers so that they also institute policies among themselves, not only to monitor, but also among labor membership, not to patronize the sex industry. So, and then the third sector would be the owners of the hotels themselves. But we work more closely with, of course, the public sector and the unions to be able to achieve this vision that we have. And the question, if sex work rhetoric has reached the Philippines, yes, it has. And unfortunately, they're coming from academics. And so many young feminists that go through the university are first initiated into this kind of ideology, and therefore our challenge for them is always to go to the grassroots, to the ground. And that's my own experience. When I was in the university, I was so blinded with this arrogance of looking, as Tegan described, as if it's going to liberate all other women when you advocate for legalization of the industry. But when I went to street prostitution and started listening to them and eventually organizing with them, then I was embarrassed. And that's when I realized that it's totally coming from circumstances of, as Ali has described, not only poverty, but previous experiences of sexual abuse. So yes, it has come into the Philippines, and it's coming strongly funded by organizations that we should probably expose for having the neoliberal framework in pushing for the commodification of everything, including women's bodies. So, and then finally, yes, the normalization and promotion of BDSM has also reinforced violence against women in prostitution. So as I have described, all of the, I'm not saying almost all, I'm absolutely saying all of the women we are organizing in prostitution experience different forms of torture.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to see how pornography is also reinforcing violence against women within prostitution. And I'd be interested to hear from Ali Marie and Tegan as well, what they are seeing or hearing from women in prostitution in New Zealand and Australia, and how BDSM has influenced their experiences of violence while in prostitution.
Before that, Jean, you and I will have a deal that early next year we're going to plan a conversation about men accountability, because without that, without accountability, we're going to go nowhere. And all the conversations that we watch in Canada and in the world about men accountability were mainly criticizing the criminal justice system, but not offering genuine alternative. It was really how to have men keep getting away with violence against women. So you and I will organize something, international conversation among feminists on that.
Agreed.
Excellent.
Yes, and there was a point that Adrienne Montani wanted you to make about unions.
Yeah.
Respond to Jean, and then.
Sure. Yeah, I'm seeing in the chat too that one of our audience members is saying that our Provincial Federation of Labor just passed a policy that sex work is work in favor of decriminalization.
In British Columbia.
In BC. And so it's, for us, it's not really possible to be in alliance with labor at this point on the issue of abolition of prostitution, because they've made a clear stance that sex work is work, which makes it difficult to have more broad-based coalitions to work towards the abolition of prostitution, of course. But back to the previous point about BDSM, Ali Marie, I don't know if you were thinking of responding, or Tegan, if you have anything to say on that topic as well.
I guess I would just say like that in general, men who buy sex often do it because they want to do things to women that their wife wouldn't accept or that they couldn't do to their girlfriend. So I think that generally already existed, where men would, you know, seek to try out their fantasies. And I think also we've seen recently in the general population a sort of increase in choking or sexual choking. And I have heard reports that this is mirrored in the sex industry as well, where so-called non-consensual choking is increasing for women in prostitution. So yeah, I mean, that, I guess that wouldn't surprise me at all if that did affect, BDSM did sort of normalize that sort of thing in the sex industry.
Any thoughts? Anyone else? No.
I think
I don't even really know how to say this. I think men in general, I don't, you know, like I remember when I was working there, men would have specific things that they wanted, you know, BDSM or fantasies or whatever else. But from what I'm hearing, and especially from my sister who worked after 2003, and even when I was there, I guess all those years ago, men have this thing, if they've paid for it, they'll take it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's regardless, you know, of anything. And, you know, we come down to things like BDSM and everything else. I think at the end of the day, it's just purely and simply violence against women. I mean, a man walks in, pays a woman for sex, thinks he now has a right to do whatever he wants to her, you know, whether that's anal or, you know, giving her a slapping or choking or pulling her hair or biting her on her neck, or, you know, it's just purely and simple violence against women. And I think sometimes we get lost in the labels.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes we overcomplicate it. And I think it's just so simple. You know, men in general who, and you know, the crazy thing is men who buy sex, men who you will walk past in the street and you wouldn't even be able to pinpoint it. You know, these are men who are husbands, fathers, grandparents, uncles, politicians, policemen, lawyers, white collars, and white Christian men. The majority of the buyers were white Christian men. So I think it's just this whole society, you know, they've come through the generations that they think that this is normal. You know, we buy a prostitute or we buy a woman, then that's okay. We can do what we like. And it's this whole, it's just so normal. And we've got to change the culture. It really is a culture. And it's got to be changed.
Mm-hmm.
yes, I'm going to make a plug, because speaking on culture, on Monday, Dani, who is today on our technical team, but she and Flo will facilitate a conversation about the impact of pornography on women and the review of our crisis work. And it's shocking to see how much strangulation is now part of mainstream sexual relationship in mainstream heterosexual couples. It's completely through pornography imported so many violent acts, a normalized violent act within ordinary relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So the triangle of pornography, prostitution, and the heterosexual relationship constantly interchanging.
Mm-hmm. I think, but Ali Marie also makes the important point that women in prostitution have always experienced violence, that this is not something new, and that it's inherent with men feeling entitled to women's bodies and feeling that once they've paid for a woman's body, they deserve to do what they want because they've paid for it. And I think that's kind of what it comes down to ultimately. And, you know, BDSM also has this, you know, element of consensual sex too that we should question in general. So that's a very interesting, important point to me.
Yeah, and women in prostitution, because some of the promotion here is about the safety of indoors, and women in street prostitution said that they prefer the street prostitution because it's fast. Once a man rented her for an hour, he has an hour to do whatever he wants to her and her body.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely consistent with what women tell us.
Mm-hmm. So I'm seeing here a question for Ali Marie. You mentioned how many of the women in prostitution in New Zealand come from other countries through immigration or trafficking. What is the process like for women to get work visas or status in order to exit into other jobs or be supported by social services? Or if you want to elaborate a bit on the kind of visas that women have who come to New Zealand.
I guess the only thing I can tell you is what I've read and what I've heard. Most women are coming in under tourist visas or student visas. The support there isn't any, because New Zealand thinks they don't have a trafficking problem. So, you know, there's no support for these women. I guess I'm sure there's some organisations, and I'm not sure, and I can't say either way, but who maybe, you know, grassroots frontline who are there trying to help these women. But if they've been trafficked in, it's a real underground world. It's hard to support women if we don't know. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's a saying in New Zealand that you can only see that you only notice the trafficking if you're actually looking for it. Otherwise you won't see it. And I remember when I was on, you know, working in the parlours, we would have, you know, groups of women coming through from other countries who would be brought in. They would stay and then they would leave, and we were always told, you don't talk to them because they don't speak English. Mm-hmm. So it's hard. There's just no support. New Zealand thinks there's not a trafficking problem. Mm-hmm. They're actually at the moment trying to get a lot of these women in. I think it's, and don't quote me, it's something they probably have to look up, but making it legal for them to be there so that they are legal to work, so that we don't have a trafficking problem. It's just so underground. It's yeah, but I guess the biggest trafficking problem is the kids. I mean, that's the biggest trafficking problem in New Zealand right now, is the children. But yeah, it's hard for me to comment on things that, you know, I talk a lot from the heart rather than from facts. So I have to be careful sometimes. But from what I can see, there's not a lot of support for them, and that's because it's hidden and it's secretive. So
we're all very much into talking from your head and talking from your heart, because you're talking about the realities of women's lives. It's not some abstract notion, it's real life of real women. So we're very good with that.
Thank you.
Tegan had a really useful comment about stigma. So Tegan, if you can speak about the stigma and also the myth here that once stigma is over, women will have no problem of complaining to the police in what even in legalized regime consider rape. Like, and women do tell us they agree to some act and the men will force another act, or they agreed on a payment and the men will rape them and then will not pay them. But there is a myth that if the stigma is gone, women will be able to complain about these men, at least to the police. So is it true? Does it work for women?
I don't think so. Like I said in that comment, the stigma is pervasive, and it means that, you know, these women are marked out as other and they're different. They're not, you know, you can't just say, you know, you've been a sex worker for this long and expect to get employed in other area or to rent a house. Like, there is a stigma that's attached to discrimination. I don't think that because it's legal, it means that women feel that they can go to the police and report rape. I think it's a very difficult area because, you know, what is rape within a system of prostitution? Is it just when the sex buyer doesn't pay? Is it when, you know, they do an act that wasn't agreed to? I think women aren't taken seriously when they go, if they went to a police to talk about rape. I don't think that they would be taken seriously because it's seen as that's what they're there for. So I wouldn't say that legalization or decriminalization has made it any easier for women to report rape within prostitution.
Good. We understand that. First, the comments that we can see on the chat are great, and we have Danny reporting us some great comments on the Facebook. So you need to know that altogether we're 65 today. Fantastic crowd. And we've got more questions.
Yeah, so a question from Facebook is, what can we do to fight decriminalization when the sex industry lobby has so much power? Any successes you'd like to report on? Any strategies that you're implementing to get media attention?
Oh, it's a good question about media attention. I can start. I want to tell you that we used to be great on getting media attention, really, really successful. And I'm sure Jean remembers when she was here in 2008, we had press conferences. We had everybody from the local and the national media. When we went in a coalition as an intervener to the Supreme Court of Canada around the prostitution law, we had full house, both in the press conferences that we did in the capital in Ottawa and in Vancouver. But what happened is once there was a debate in the Supreme Court of Canada, the mainstream media, one editorial after the other, took a clear position of treating prostitution as sex work. And since then, we virtually were boycotted. We published the data about our work with women in prostitution, and each of the data is newsworthy. We got silence. Clay and London Abused Women's Center at the end of August published the first survey that has been done in Canada about Canadian attitude towards a new law that shows that 10% is objecting the law, 40% don't understand the law and not sure, and 50% are supporting the law that criminalize men. Except one local media outlet, no media picked it up. So we, at the moment, quite discouraged and have no hope from the mainstream media. The progressive, alternative, liberal media is completely wrong on the issue of prostitution. So what we do, we're doing our own media. We're doing this. We have a podcast, we have a blog, we have flyers, we have, there is Feminist Scoring, there's other feminist websites, there is Ren and Sanders, a North American magazine. We're talking to each other, we're telling the truth without the mediation of the mainstream media. At the moment, there is no interest in cooperation in the truth. Unlike the other sites, they get a full coverage. There is a lot of kind of crooked logic about how the law that is not being reinforced, by the way, makes women unsafe. So the law is not being implemented in most provinces. So it doesn't do anything. And there is just a crooked logic that the media is not challenging about criminalized men will make women unsafer. The idea of criminalized men is to stopping them from harming women. So in terms of media, we're off. In terms of grassroots support, women's reality, alliances, local, national, and international, we're really, really strong. So that's where we put our effort.
Pia, if I may share, I would just want to share 4 points. I think what's very important to begin with, because media will follow when these basic things are done, we feel. Well, one, it's solid survivors organizing. So we have really huge membership of survivors, and we make connections also in organizing them among the various issues that they are facing right now. For example, prostitution gets even more intense as killings, as I mentioned earlier, is also happening in the Philippines. So let me just illustrate, for example, the survivor leader that spoke 2 days ago, November 25, in our action at the Commission on Human Rights. So we have a huge mobilization of survivors. We are able to mobilize more than other groups of women can mobilize. And I think that's really very important. And second, I think young women organizing is also very fundamental, and media again will follow because they are very articulate, they are very strong, and their fresh voices are also very necessary in arguing against the sex industry, and very nuanced arguments are coming from our young women and even young men that we have organized who are advocates against the sex industry. Third, I think it's very important to make the alliances. I noted that our friends here are having a problem with the labor sector, but we are also leading coalitions of farmers, of workers, of other grassroots organizations, and to be able to lead them and to tell them that the correct position on prostitution is to oppose the sex industry and to oppose legalization and not to call it sex work, but to consider it as a form of violence against women already leads the way for various sectors of struggling grassroots people. And then finally, I think what's really important is make that integrated campaigns along with the fight against authoritarianism or militarism, globalization, neoliberal capitalism, so that it's not only us as working in silos as feminist groups, but really working with various sectors of oppressed people.
Ali, do you want to speak to that, or Tegan?
Sorry, can you just repeat that?
What is your success with getting media attention or campaigning when there's such a strong decriminalization lobby or a sex workers work lobby in New Zealand? Do you have any successful strategies to get your message out in New Zealand or in Australia?
I still missed that a little bit, sorry, so I'll just answer what I heard. The sound went a bit funny, but it's back now. I guess the way we're getting our message out is just being consistent. And I think that's the biggest thing, is we're just being consistent and we're making sure that we're heard. The pro-lobby are extremely loud and they are very disruptive, and I think that's why they're heard so much. So I think for us to be heard, we need to be as equally as loud and disruptive. We really need to be honing in on the points that, you know, prostitution is violence against women, that not everyone in the sex trade is there by choice. I think that's really, really important. We hear a lot about, you know, that women are choosing to be in the sex trade, that it's empowering. And I think it's really important that we argue back on these statements that the pro-lobby makes. Can I do a shout out, by the way, for our book? Because I really think this is where the booklet comes in that Katwa and Wahine Toa Rising have just done together. And I think the booklet that we've done, I think everyone really needs, I challenge everyone to download a copy of that PDF, which you can find on either Katwa's website or Wahine Toa Rising's website. Really important to download it. 16 myths in there, 16 myths busted. It's really short, it's simple. The fact sheets that you can grab and you can take and repeat. You can send it to all your members of parliament, you can send it to council members, you can send it to organisations. This is a really, really powerful tool. And I think this is where change is going to happen, is the consistency. So if we all get together, we grab this booklet, we keep repeating these things over and over and over again, we will eventually get through. That's my hope. And I'm going to hold on to that hope, because unity is key. But we have to keep it simple, and I think that's the biggest key. Keeping things simple, being consistent, and just repeating it over and over and over again.
Yeah, I think if I just could add to that, I'm sort of just echoing everybody else, but Katwa has really struggled to get any media attention on sort of this issue in general, but even targeted around particular things. So like I mentioned, the review, you know, which was a clear conflict of interest, and there were so many points that were wrong with it, like that it wasn't really a review, that it was being led by a woman who has, you know, links to the pro-sex lobby. Her husband's still involved. Like, there were so many points that we thought the media could have grabbed onto, even from, you know, without taking a position on the sex industry, but just from that sort of like, yeah, conflict of interest position. And it's sort of like just silence. Like, we send media releases out, we don't get anything back. We really struggle to get traction on any issue. And I think this sex work ideology is extremely strong. It's really entrenched in Australia. when there are feminist events or organizations, a sex worker who, like I mentioned, isn't really a sex worker, but represents one of these pro-prostitution lobby groups, will be invited to speak, you know, as a representative of all sex workers. And this is just consistently what's happening. We're seeing this sort of, dogma be really sort of entrenched to the point where you can't join feminist groups unless you sort of, you know, repeat that mantra, sex workers work. And if you try to question it, you're sort of prevented from even mentioning or bringing up anything other that doesn't fall into this celebratory empowerment sort of narrative. And like I mentioned, this leads to people who call themselves feminists actively silencing survivors, shutting down debate, not letting anyone sort of question any of these, you know, truths and realities. But I think that the media is just sort of completely on that side of things as well. And there is that confusion because when they look for comment, they look to the peak sex worker organization or other sex worker peer organizations, which are these pro-prostitution lobby groups. So there's very little room for them to sort of, look to survivors, I guess, and to want to promote survivor voices.
Okay, well,
Dire situation,
it's a dire situation.
But I think what's obvious from this conversation, the truth is on our side. The women who know the reality of women in prostitution is on our side. The common sense and the good heart is on our side. And I agree, Ali, what you said about unity. Together we can win.
Yes.
And the 60 people who are listening today, we had 60 people yesterday. We had a conversation with Cleone Santos, who works with women in prostitution in Luz in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. There is a lot of support on the ground. Women know the reality of women. Women know that they do not want it to themselves. Why would they want it to for their fellow women? So, yeah.
Is there anything that any of the panelists would like to add that they think is important to make in this conversation before we wrap up for this evening?
And you have a chance, all of you are watching, if you want to say last words in the chat. I cannot see it, I'm half blind, but Sophia can read some highlights, and Danny will pass us what you're saying on Facebook. We do see the many appreciations that all of our guests are receiving constantly through those comments.
I should also say, and I guess because I think it's really good that we celebrate the wins as well as the losses, I guess. The New Zealand media has been amazing with Wahine Toa Rising. So we've had some awesome interviews with survivors. We've had press releases that have been released. Like, they have been incredibly supportive of us. So I just want to acknowledge that while I'm here, because I think it's really important that we celebrate those wins as well as the, you know, the losses. So yeah.
I agree, and the same with the Cat W in Philippines.
Yeah.
It has an impact and it has a ripple effect. The success that we have in locally is impacting and supporting, giving us some wind here. And yeah.
I guess I would just say, oh, sorry, you go.
Sorry, Tegan, go ahead.
I was just going to quickly sort of address this, the way that decriminalisation is being framed as a progressive policy. It's being taken up and certainly in Australia by the Greens Party, and it's sort of seen as a progressive policy or progressive way forward. And I just want to sort of, I guess, you know, remind people, or I guess no one here needs to probably be reminded, but the ideas that decriminalisation is based on are the same outdated, you know, regressive ideas that prostitution itself is based on. And so, like, if we look at Australia, prostitution was established by the white colonisers. Like, there's no evidence that prostitution existed in Indigenous Australia before white people invaded. So white people institutionalised prostitution. They set up prostitution, as well as widespread, you know, rape and concubinage and other forms of sexual slavery of Indigenous women, but also white convict women, And so they sort of institutionalized this prostitution, and it was all based on this idea that men and male convicts have uncontrollable sex drive. They need access to sexual access to women, or they'll, you know, be uncontrollable, or whatever the justification was at the time. And decriminalization in modern times is still based on this same idea that men have an uncontrollable sex drive. They need sexual access to women. And I think we've debunked this sort of as a rape myth in other areas, but when it comes to prostitution, it still remains so strong, or it goes unquestioned, this idea that prostitution is inevitable because men will always, you know, seek it out. And so instead we try to, decriminalization is a way to mitigate harm. We recognize that harm's involved, but we're trying to sort of mitigate it or minimize it, rather than eradicate it or sort of say no harm is acceptable. And you know, I think we really need to look at which women are expected to fill this role, because it's not the myth of the sex worker who's usually white, university educated, you know, can choose to just engage in the sex industry whenever they want. It is marginalized women in Australia. It is, you know, there is an overrepresentation of Asian and other migrant women, women who are on uncertain visas, who have low levels of English language. So, you know, this, yeah, I guess just this idea that it's a progressive policy, we really need to question it, and we really need to try and think a bit more hopefully. I think it's a really sort of defeatist position, like it's inevitable, so therefore we can't do anything about it, so let's just try to minimize it rather than eradicate it. Like, we don't take this approach to any other sort of crime, even though arguably you could never eradicate rape or murder. We still aim to, and we still work towards that. So I think this is the way we need to be looking at prostitution.
Thanks, Tegan. And there's also many, many thank yous coming from everyone watching on Zoom and over Facebook. And I see two women are asking for the booklet mentioned by Ali Marie, so we'll be sure to share it on our social media. So
yeah, we'll put it tomorrow. We'll put it on our Facebook and on our website. We'll put the link.
Apparently it's actually there already.
Oh.
So if you're on the internet already watching this live stream, you can just go on our Facebook and see the booklet.
I think Jean wanted to say something.
And then we also have a comment from Jean Sarson on Facebook that she was told by a publisher that they would not be taking op-eds on prostitution because there's too much support for the decriminalization of prostitution. So media are explicitly saying that they are unwilling to publish our position because of the pressure they're facing from the decriminalization lobby. So it is definitely very much a reality. So yeah, thank you so much to our panelists for speaking today and giving your different perspectives from your different countries and illustrating to us the similarities and the differences.
Jean, did you have last words you wanted to say?
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much, Hila. So other than going to Wahine Towa Rising Facebook and also CATW Australia, where the booklet is, I just want to say that in behalf of the survivors, not only in the Philippines and the rest of Asia and perhaps the Pacific, we really want to put greater attention to how they're specifically suffering under COVID, because many of our sisters will be listening to this later on Facebook. I just want to say that it's important that the world knows that some of my sisters here are dying because of infection of customers, even during the pandemic. So police are taking advantage of the hunger, of the lack of safety nets by third world governments, and therefore many of them are approached by the police and other male customers, and one of our sisters died a week ago, and I just want to put that out so that the people know how extremely hard it is even now for our survivors of prostitution. But thank you for the inspiration. It's always great to meet sisters around the world despite the pandemic, and we can't really physically come together as Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter used to bring us together. Thank you so much, Hila and Lee Lakeman, Diane, Matt, my mentors in Canada. I salute you all. Thank you for this opportunity.
Great. So tomorrow and the second part of the conversation.
Yeah, so this video event will be available immediately on Facebook. And tomorrow's event, Race, Class, and Male Violence Against Women, the first part, will be streaming at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And the second part of this conversation, where we'll be having Ingeborg Kraus from Germany, Elisa Bernard from Seattle, Gada Jabbour from Lebanon, and Diane Matt from Quebec to give us the Canadian perspective, will be on Tuesday, December 1st at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So we're hoping that everyone who is here today can join us for a continuation of the conversation, and you can watch that again live on Facebook or over Zoom. And you can visit our website, rapereliefshelter.bc.ca, for all the links to each event. And for now, we will see you tomorrow.
Thank you so much. A special thank you for the UK sister who put an alarm to see us at 4 a.m. her time. It's just been a pleasure to have all of you with us, and thank you for the responsive crowd and supporters that we have. We feel you, we feel your support every day in our work and today as well. We'll see you all tomorrow. Love and solidarity.
Thank you. Thanks so much.